Hi, I'm Cheryl Galen, Interim Executive Presbyter with Carlisle Presbytery, and I'm here with the commissioners you elected to the 224th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. This General Assembly, like almost everything else in our lives this year, was significantly altered when it became clear that an in-person meeting in Baltimore was not possible. So our denomination's first ever digital assembly took place in June, and as is our custom, our commissioners have prepared a brief report describing what the experience was like, some of what came out of the assembly, and some of what was postponed. Before we launch into the questions, how about if each of you commissioners introduce yourself, tell us your name, whether you're a ruling elder or a teaching elder, and the congregation you call your spiritual home.
Hello, my name is Pat Butler. I'm a ruling elder at Second Presbyterian Church, Carlisle.
I'm Cheryl Betts. I'm the moderator of Carlisle Presbytery right now, and I'm also the Director of Christian Education at Gettysburg Presbyterian Church.
I'm Ron Martin-Minnick. I'm a teaching elder, honorably retired, and most recently I served the Upper West Presbyterian Church in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania.
And I'm Graham Fowler. I am a teaching elder and I pastor Lost Creek and McCoysville Presbyterian churches.
Thanks. So we have a few questions that we will ask you and look forward to hearing your responses. Pat, let's start with you. This was your first experience with a General Assembly. What surprised you about the gathering of people who appeared on your Zoom screen? And what impressions did you take away from this experience that give you hope for the work and witness of the PCUSA?
Thank you. My first experience with General Assembly was to be a week in Baltimore. Whew. I was anticipating learning much and participating in the Presbyterian Church in a way that I'd only ever heard about. And then COVID. I was a little less eager about a Zoom experience of General Assembly, but I came away from my 2 days on Zoom with a belief that we are part of an amazing body of Christ. I'll share a couple of impressions. So many of the leaders and of the people that I saw were people of color. The moderators, staff, committee, and task force leaders. I realized that the PCUSA has made an intentional effort to identify these people for their gifts and talents and place them in places of leadership. In a predominantly white church, I was glad to see that we can be inclusive. Second, I was so amazed and moved by the, by the knowledge and preparation of the participants who spoke and their perseverance to bring forward their concerns. Clearly, there was a lot of texting and phone calls and emails going back and forth as individuals worked as a group to speak to their concerns. Passion is probably the best word I can use to describe many of the speakers. They were committed to their purpose, speaking persistently for causes of social justice. And then there was inclusive language. Every speaker used inclusive language in race, gender, and ethnicity. One interesting usage was that rather than saying brothers and sisters, the speakers would say siblings. Weird, I thought, until I thought, maybe this is good. It highlights our relationship to each other as members of the family without regard to gender. Our focus is the relationship. I felt the leadership of those persons in seriously considering language and being willing to change was important to me. And I can't say enough about experiencing the passion and commitment of so many to make change. I saw people committed to Christ's work in the world and to the movement of the Spirit among us with a full heart. It brought me hope and a level of peace for our communities. Attending GA was fascinating and a hopeful look at our church. And it was 2 days well spent sitting in front of Zoom.
Thank you. It was great. So let's move to Ron. So Ron, the General Assembly met shortly after the death of George Floyd and the outbreak of protests all over our country. We know that the Assembly adopted a statement on racism that's drawn quite a range of reactions. Some think it went too far, while others think it didn't say enough. Could you give us some context to help us understand?
407 commissioners approved this overture, which is known as 0029. And the statement that opened the overture was, "Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to live in." Isaiah 58, verse 12. That's the RSV version. What may have upset people is sometimes when the church approves an overture, the language is intended to disturb, not only to guide and improve the denomination, but to awaken people to things that they might have accepted that they should not have. And so whenever we do that, we should not be surprised that people will reject the wording, that people will want to change the wording, or some people will want to vote down the overture, as 72 people did. Now, those 72 people may have not voted it down because they did not agree with the overture's content, but did not, as you said, feel it went far enough. This is the main content of that overture. This 224th General Assembly of the PCUSA declares that Black Lives Matter, that our country's most important institutions have been built to sustain white privilege, to protect white lives and white property at the expense of our siblings of color, and that the church, through ignorance, denial, and in some cases deliberate action, has participated in the injustice. We have been slow as fellow Presbyterians, of our fellow Christians, of our fellow citizens, to acknowledge the pain. And those who have come to America for a better life, whose value has been judged by the color of their skin, we pledge to join hands and hearts with our siblings to actively confront and dismantle systemic racism in our church and in our society at large, and to work for a more just, merciful, and peaceful country that allows all of God's children to flourish. We spent 3.5 hours to perfect this single overture. The amendments that were made that changed the language was in the very first line, because originally it included black and brown. People did not feel that was accurate in the intent of this overture. So "and brown" was removed. They also wanted to remove a more inclusive language throughout the document, which included brown and indigenous people. That was rejected because that felt that it was, again, changing the intent. We added an extensive statement about responding to the love of God. And we also made sure that there were references to the different types of things that the denomination has already been involved with and supported, and the types of resources that are available to help people to understand the direction that this overture is intending people to take. It is not, I felt, an overture that seeks just to judge people, but seeks to bring people together, that seeks to unite us in an effort to eliminate things that we may not be sensitive to. Because, as was pointed out, 90% of our denomination is white. And this General Assembly started with a worship service that sought to make sure we acknowledge those who are not white, that are significant members of our denomination, specifically people of color and people who are Native American. We also, because of that, we're not surprised, not only because of who they were in terms of ethnicity, but the quality of people that they were, that we elected co-moderators who were African American and Native American, and resoundingly re-elected our stated clerk who is African American. And there's one thing that he said that I felt should guide us as we look at this overture and take it seriously. He used the phrase, stir the Kool-Aid, which means to make sure that we get the full flavor, because unless you stir some Kool-Aid that you've mixed, if you've let it sit for a while, it may not taste the same unless you stir it. Why some people have rejected this overture is because of one sentence toward the end of the overture. And this is how it reads. While we recognize and honor the work towards justice that has been happening and continues at every level of the PCUSA, we also name that in this time it is not enough. We must become actively anti-racist in our theology, policy, and praxis. When our colleagues, siblings, and neighbors protest in the streets to say that being Black should never be an excuse to be targeted and killed, when so many stand in solidarity to say Black Lives Matter, and what our own communities are weighed down in grief and anger, it is the time to stand alongside our Black and Brown and Native American siblings in voice and in action. The actual overture uses the acronym BIPOC in capital letters, and that's what it refers to. People who are Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So some people take this overture to say that it is advocating support of the organization Black Lives Matter. And that is not what it is doing. It is asking us to acknowledge the fact that how can we say all lives matter if Black lives do not matter, if we can exempt our concerns from people who are different from us. So I know some people have already left the denomination. I know some people have found it hard to acknowledge that racism exists. And I say to you, as someone who appears to be Caucasian, that I have a niece and a nephew who would be considered African American. I have relatives by marriage who are African American. And when you talk to someone who is different than you are, and they are honest with you, you will be surprised at the experiences that they have had and the types of things that they have experienced just because you can tell that they're different from someone who is Caucasian. I'm also a retired Army chaplain, and every year that I served, which was almost 30, I would deal with incidents of racism and sexism every year. These things exist, and for the church to ignore them and to feel that it doesn't matter to us is a major mistake. We need to be honest. We need to be loving. We need to acknowledge two things that we cannot deny that are part of our scriptural guidance and authority. One, the most important, when we say that we shall love our neighbor as ourselves, that is not a type of concept that we consider optional. It is who we are to be, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And when people challenged Jesus to explain, who is my neighbor? It was very simple after he explained the parable of the prodigal son, the one who is in need. And he didn't use something that was comfortable or that most people were going to like in that parable. He used Samaritans, people that Jews at that time hated. They didn't even walk through Samaria. They used a road to avoid going through that area if they were going from northern Israel to southern Israel. So at the heart of who we are as Christians is love of neighbor as ourselves. And who is our neighbor? The one who is in need.
Thank you for some rich storytelling that helps us move from a statement on a page, an overture adopted, to understanding more of the context that led to those words that were ultimately adopted, and for connecting that to the scriptural message of Jesus. Thank you, Ron. So Cheryl, one of the highlights of every General Assembly is the election of the co-moderators. The last General Assembly, it was a really close race with many rounds of ballots. This year, the co-moderators were elected by a large majority on the very first ballot. Tell us who the Assembly elected, and why do you think this team was so clearly the choice of the majority of the commissioners?
At this General Assembly, we had 3 sets of co-moderators to hear from, to ask questions of. And by doing this, we were able to narrow it down on the first vote of 65% who voted for Gregory Bentley, an African-American and pastor of a church in Huntsville, Alabama, and Alona Street Stewart, a ruling elder from the Presbytery of the Twin Cities, and the first Native American moderator to be elected. She is originally from the Delaware Nanacote tribe. And I believe the reason this was so easily done at this General Assembly was that these 2 co-moderators were able to embrace the Matthew 25 initiative and recognize the diversity of the mutuality of gifts around us in the church and in our world. I think they will be great moderators and will have our denomination entering into areas that we have not been as active as we should have been in the past. This will be an exciting year to see where they take us.
All right, thank you. And so now we come to Graham. So Graham, you've had the experience of attending many General Assemblies, but this one, conducted by Zoom, was unique. Would you describe for us how this format both limited and focused the work of the Assembly? And tell us a little bit about what happens now with the business that was postponed.
Thanks, Cheryl. I want to say that one of the strengths of our denomination can also be one of its greatest challenges. We are a very diverse denomination. We have people who come from all corners of the nation, all walks of life, and they cover the spectrum of social and theological viewpoints. So when we gather for a General Assembly, presbyteries and commissioners bring resolutions seeking to address all sorts of issues. And we need to provide financial resources, time, energy to these different things. And of course, they're all important. And we'd love to approve all of them. And so we do. The problem is, I think we end up spreading ourselves too thin, and we aren't able to address any of them adequately. So when the decision was made to have this year's General Assembly held electronically, one of the things the coordinators decided from the beginning was to keep it simple. In the past, we've had 3 or 4 days of committee meetings. All the commissioners divide up into different committees and evaluate different items of business coming before the General Assembly and make recommendations on what they think the entire body ought to do. but that's 10 or 12 hours a day, and trying to do that by Zoom would have been very difficult. So they eliminated committees, and therefore a lot of the time that we could spend discussing all the different things that our denomination was being asked to do. But I think that helped us focus on what we really wanted to talk about and deal with right here, right now. It also helped us to think about what things could wait till the next General Assembly. And it also made us think about the fact that there were churches and presbyteries and synods out there that could already do a lot of this work on their own without having it to be done by the General Assembly. So along with receiving reports for information and approving a variety of people to serve in roles throughout our denomination, the commissioners picked 4 issues that they felt needed to be addressed right now. One of them you've already heard Ron talk about was on racism. Another was on the effects of the pandemic. Another was to modify our statements on the protection of children, youth, and vulnerable adults to make them more effective. And the last one was about the rights of Native Americans. And the items of business coming to our General Assembly about Native Americans was intended to be postponed for another 2 years. But the commissioners, by a supermajority, voted that that was something we needed to talk about right now. And 2 of the items that they talked about were directing all levels of our denomination to advocate for the rights of Native Americans, and then also to direct organizations within our denomination who have money for Native American ministries to release those funds and allow them to be used for repairing the sanctuaries of our Native American congregations, because many of them have been left unrepaired for decades and were in a shambles. So those were the 4 things that we focused on in our two evening meetings, or 2 daytime meetings. There were things that were passed on to the next General Assembly. They'll be dealt with in 2 years. A few of those things had to do with racism. And in the statement that we made about racism, we encouraged congregations and presbyteries and synods not to simply wait for 2 years before looking at these documents and reviewing them and talking about how we can start to put their recommendations in place now, but to go ahead and do that right now. And that was disparities experienced by Black women and girls, a report from the Special Committee on Racism, Truth, and Reconciliation, a report about gun violence called Lazarus is Walking in Baltimore, and another report that was addressing the lack of installed pastoral leadership in people of color congregations. So even though those particular documents have been postponed, we are asking churches and presbyteries and synods to go ahead and look at them now and see, is there something we can do about those right now? So it was disappointing not being able to meet in person, not being able to do the full work of the General Assembly, but I think it gave us a chance to really focus on what is it that we want to do as a denomination, and what are things that can be done better by the churches, the presbyteries, and the synods. And as we start looking toward the next General Assembly in 2 years, I wonder if there's a way that we can focus our attention better so that the decisions we do make can be fulfilled in a way that is effective and that really brings glory to God. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you. So this presentation is intended for use by sessions. If your session wants to know more about what happened at the General Assembly, we recommend you go to pc-biz.org which is the online portal that holds all of the business of the General Assembly. Our commissioners are also willing to answer your questions if you would like to be in touch with them. We thank you for your attention to our report, and especially we thank you for the work and witness of your congregation. May the peace of Christ be with us all. Thank you. Bye.